Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
What do you do when troubles come to your life? What do you do when things don't work out? What do you do when the world seems to fall apart around you and you feel demoralized? You feel like there's no hope and you're struggling and you're frustrated and everyone else seems to be making decisions that are baffling to you. And you feel like a lone wolf saying, I don't know if this is the way we want to go, guys. And I feel so demoralized. Like, I feel like we just took 3 steps backward after getting a step forward. And I'm frustrated. What do you do when you feel like this? That's what we want to talk about on today's show.
Yeah, that sense of powerlessness, where the powers that be make decisions, or that we end up in a situation that feels like it's going to have an inevitable bad result, and that you don't feel like you have power over your environment. Because we talk a lot about personal empowerment and the things that we do to make our own individual lives better. But that doesn't mean that, as we go down this road of self-development, that necessarily the people around us are making the same decisions. And we are not just subjects in this world. We're not just individuals that are going through our experience. We are also impacted by the people around us, and we're impacted by the context around us, the environment, the choices that other people are making. And so we can get to a place where we feel like we're in a really good place, and then we look around and the world feels like it's burning around us. So what do you do to keep your morale up? What do you do to continue to feel like there's some hope when the context around you feels hopeless?
Yeah, I think what prompted this, so we're not going to get into anything specific, but around the time of this recording, and I don't know when you're listening to this recording, you might be listening to it years from now, but there have been a lot of political shifts in the world in recent times. So, in Europe, there have been some votes and some shifts in how different countries are relating to each other. In the United States, we just had a political election where we elected a bunch of officials for top levels of presidency, all the way down to governorships and senators and congressmen. And it feels like the world is definitely going through a lot of shifts around this, that the people that win all those shifts, the people that push those shifts forward feel really good about that situation. And I've noticed that a lot of people that didn't want those things to happen feel demoralized. They feel like their world is ending. And I've noticed that a lot of people are, I wouldn't say giving up, but I've noticed people get really cynical, and just the energy feels down. And it feels like, it almost feels like people are wallowing in a negative energy because they didn't get the result they wanted.
Yeah.
And I feel it. I understand the feeling, the temptation of that feeling. Like, you put a lot of hopes and dreams and things into having a certain outcome, and you worked really hard with your energy and maybe even helping people understand your position, and you really thought that things were going to move forward, from your perspective, you listening, and maybe things didn't move the way you wanted them to, or maybe they did, and you're frustrated that people around you seem so down, and why are you so disheartened, and their choices don't seem to make sense too. And So I think this wallowing in any kind of misery is what I notice, and I think we want to address this today of how do you deal with the troubles that come, the setbacks, the things in life that feel out of your control, that you almost just want to keep digging into and feeling that icky feeling around. I don't think it's healthy for us as people.
Yeah, well, I want to address that concept of wallowing, because I don't think that anybody experiences themselves as wallowing. I think what happens is that it almost feels like there's something sick and there's a need to attend to it. So when people stay in that state, or when they were disappointed and stay disappointed, and even when they go through the level of grief to anger, because I think what I'm experiencing is a lot of, around me, and even within myself to some extent, is a sense of grief. And anger is a part of that. So I also see a lot of people just kind of flipping the bird to the entire year, actually, that we're in right now. That this is the worst year ever, and this is a terrible year. And so I think what happens is it's not so much wallowing as I think on one side it's an attempt to feel some empowerment or power in the situation by going through grief and getting to the anger aspect of grief. But I also think there's a concern that we weren't attending to something, and because we weren't attending to it, the results that we got were undesirable, and so we need to be focused on it. We need to be aware. And so it's hard to separate this sense of increased awareness with like by focusing and being aware of the thing you didn't want without also the dissatisfaction following you. Like it clings to you like a barnacle. So what ends up being a desire to maintain a heightened sense of awareness and to be ready and to be active to do whatever you can. Because I think that's another thing I've been hearing a lot of people say is, what can I do? What can I do? I feel so powerless. What can I do? By keeping aware, but not having that initial disappointment and that initial frustration and that the time period of anger, stay with the heightened awareness. So then that's what feels like wallowing, or that's what feels like a general sense of negativity. And you've mentioned before that when we bring a general sense of negativity to everything, when we're constantly maybe even catastrophizing a situation, as much as, I mean, for the time period that we push that out into the world, if it's like an initial reaction, it's probably going to be okay. But if we keep doing it and we keep cross-pollinating each other's catastrophizing, what we end up doing is we end up creating it. We end up creating the catastrophe that we thought was going to, that we feared would originally happen, which I think happens at least, again, I don't know when you're listening to this recording, but I think that's kind of happened in the last presidential administration, is that there was this sense that everything was going to be terrible from the other side of the aisle, like from the other political party that was not in office. And so they ended up creating that result to some extent. They ended up like obstructing, and they ended up, removing an ability to solve problems by saying, well, you're not the person who has the solution, so we're not going to let you do anything. And then the problems, some of the challenges and problems got worse, or they fed into it. And so what can happen, no side of the aisle is going to be exempt from this. So if you're in a situation right now where you're very dissatisfied with the results of, say, a presidential election, or the results of, a law being passed, or how or whoever's in positions of power and how they got there, one of the things that is difficult to separate but cannot be conflated for your own personal sense of self-satisfaction to keep your morale up is you have to separate this idea of being aware and being active and being focused on the challenges you want to solve without having that initial boost, which was massive dissatisfaction, cloying to you. Like, can you shift the motivation away from something that was originally negative? Can you shift it into something positive? Can you pivot and stay aware and stay active and stay focused on solving challenges without it being fueled by a general sense of negativity or a general sense of dissatisfaction?
Yeah, you will get what you look for in life. And often I've noticed the energies I put out are the energies I get back. So I think there is a period of time, so one of the challenges we have here is we want to try to stay, from a personal growth standpoint, as neutral as possible around any hot button topics like candidate versus candidate or political stance versus political stance, because we believe that there's a personal growth message that transcends any of those lower level dichotomous ways of thinking. We probably will, in the very near future, think and talk about creating content that is a little more direct in tackling some of these issues that we see. It might be more controversial. You might not agree with us, but I think we have a good approach of how we want to go about talking about specific issues and really deep dive into them in a systemic way. Having said that, we're keeping things a little ethereal right now because, again, this might be dated for you. You might be listening to this a long time from now, so it's not as relevant as it is right now when it's released.
Well, and this is the main podcast, and I think the main podcast, we'll always want to keep it focused on development.
Exactly.
And politics can be distracting from people's individual development. So like you said, we've actually talked about creating content that is more directed towards, topics that like very much more topical. That would be not the main podcast. That would be like a secondary podcast we would create.
Yeah. And so that's probably coming down the pike very soon. And so that's exciting for us because we have a belief in ourselves that we can tackle some of those issues in a really pragmatic and space holding way. Having said that, it is exciting when we can do a main podcast and take some of the personal growth things that we've talked about, the tool sets, the frameworks, the models, and give more application to them. Oftentimes when you're talking about personal growth, you have to talk in terms of very ethereal. Well, if you have a relationship, here's the general principles of what you want to do. And it's nice when you have something to frame things around, have something to apply some of these tools to. And what's great about this, if you've been listening for a while, if you've been part of the Personality Hacker community and you've been a part of this podcast for a while, we have given out and articulated and deep dived, I don't know how you'd say that. We've gone deep into a lot of the tool sets and frameworks that you can use in your personal life to get through certain challenges you might have, whether they're relationship challenges. We talked obviously about your personality in great detail and how you can slice and dice your personality and use it to your best advantage and grow yourself as a person. We've talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the Graves model. We've talked about all these different frameworks and models of seeing the world, understanding yourself, and often we talk about them and applying them into your individual life and your individual circumstance. And what I think we'd encourage you to do today is let's start thinking about ways we can apply those same principles, those same frameworks, the same ways of thinking about yourself. Now let's apply them more to a macro level. Can we expand these outward when things happen in life that you feel so out of control of? Frameworks can help you get control of yourself, but are there ways to take these same frameworks and apply them to circumstances outside yourself? And I don't care what those circumstances are in particular, but can we apply those frameworks to those outside circumstances? And I think we can. And I think that's what I would like to do today is really give you some tangible, specific ways that you can stretch and move some of the things we've talked about in past podcasts and apply them to the world that seems so confusing sometimes, so out of control, and gain a sense of empowerment, even in the midst of despair or even in the midst of frustration, whatever that might be for you.
Yeah. And I think one of the first ones to really look at is the Graves model, like you mentioned, spiral dynamics. So if you've never heard of the Graves model or spiral dynamics, I recommend that you go listen to that podcast. And we've also written articles about it on the Personality Hacker blog. So go check those out. But for those of you who are familiar with the Graves model, as we've talked about, if you have applied that to your personal development journey, you might recognize that within you, you are actually stratified. There are aspects of your personality that are going to be at higher and lower levels on the hierarchy. And that's normal. Everybody is stratified. There are components of us that got more fleshed out lessons than other aspects of us. And as we grow, a part of what we're doing is we're identifying those parts of who we are, and we're trying to bring them in alignment, and we're trying to bring them all up to the same level. Well, society is a macrocosm of us as a microcosm individually. So society is also stratified. If we look at the political climate from the lens of stratified levels, you can see why certain candidates were more attractive to certain people than other candidates. You can see why there is a lot of infighting, even within political parties, because not everybody's at the same level. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people at higher levels are right. People at lower levels could be more accurate in their assessment of what's going on. But what we really see is a lack of communication because they're seeing something different. They're seeing different amounts of territory. They're taking in different pieces of information. Different values are important to them. And so on a macrocosm or cosmic level, a big piece of why people are just generally dissatisfied with how everything went down for the most part is because there's still all that infighting. So then the question becomes, what can we do to help communicate to each other that we are at stratified levels? Or what can we do to talk to people at different levels, speaking their language? Just like we have to do with ourselves, just like when we're doing our own personal development. The parts of us that are less developed, we have to speak to differently than the parts of us that are developed. And the parts of us that are more developed are generally more responsible for altering their language to meet the people who, or the parts of us that are at lower levels, Like, it's the responsibility of the best parts of us or the highest level parts of us to contextualize things to the lowest parts of us. Now, when we take that macrocosmically, that might sound really condescending. Like, the best of you have to, recontextualize for the worst of you. And that's not really what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that when you are a higher level of development, you have the ability to remember where you were at when you were at a lower level of development. Though that's not a value statement. You weren't a bad person when you were at a lower level of development, and you're not necessarily a good person at a higher level. That's the point of personal development and growth, is that we're all trying to be the best versions of ourselves, the highest quality character and in integrity, regardless of our level of development. So we're not really talking about the quality of somebody's character. We're just talking about how much territory they're taking in, how much of the world they're able to see. And when you're at a higher level of development, it means you can take in more territory and you have a reference point of what it felt like when you were at a lower level. So a big piece of what you can bring to this context, if you are at a higher level, one of the things that you can bring to the situation in the environment is the ability to meet people where they're at. Now, if you're not at a higher level, one of the things you can do when you recognize and understand the Graves model is you can realize that there are other people who might be seeing things that you can't see yet. So it keeps you in a place of curiosity, as opposed to sticking by your position and assuming you're right and assuming that, you've got the right way of going about things. It encourages us to open up our curiosity, because somebody that we're talking to who might be taking a different position than us, it might not be because they're wrong and we're right. It might be that they're seeing something we're not seeing, and we can address them instead of with hostility or even a sense of despair. We can address them with curiosity and an openness to what they have to say.
Yeah, and so let's get a little more specific here. Again, I'm not going to go into like actual political candidates, but right now at the time of this recording, the world is shifting away from, there was a lot of movement in the past maybe decade of globalization. I mean, the world is getting more global, more interconnected. And in recent times, in the last year or two, a lot of nation states around the world are saying, you know what? We don't want to be connected to other countries and other people groups. We want to close our borders. We want to just stay focused on ourselves. And this is not just the United States. This is Europe, parts of Europe, other parts of the world too. We're just going to pull back in. We're not going to be so connected. We're going to not be as open with our trade deals. We're not going to be as open with other people groups around the world. We need to take care of our own here at home first. And there's this huge perspective shift that has gone this direction. Now, from my perspective and what I can see from where I sit as the current time of this recording, it is inevitable that the world will be interconnected on a global level, economically, socially, and from an ecological standpoint, environmentally, because we all have a lot of environmental shifts and challenges coming at a global scale as well. Now, I'm in a place where I seem to have that viewpoint. I see that coming. It feels inevitable to me. I can't see a perspective where we will be able to pull our nation states back in around our own little borders and not play nice with other people outside of our own countries or outside of our own people group. I just don't see it as possible. But there are a lot of people that they feel like that is the right choice. That's the right direction their country or their people group should make in the world. And so that's a big conversation happening right now around the world. And that's a lot of actual elections have happened. A lot of political decisions have happened around that. It seems to be the tone of pulling back from that interconnected piece. And so how do we look at that? Do we say, well, maybe those people that are pulling those borders in see something I don't see? And there is some truth to that. I think the people that have gone down that road and want to move there, maybe on the ground in the countries they're in, and they're seeing something happen they don't like. They're having an experience of something that doesn't feel good to them. It feels out of control. It feels bad. It feels like they're losing something, like maybe their country's getting taken from them or they're losing out somehow. And they feel like they have to make a stand to bring it back in and conserve what was there in the past or conserve what they have now. And I can understand that sentiment. I don't think I fully see and can experience what those people that feel that way are experiencing. I don't have the embodiment of that. I've done a lot of work and I have family members and other people that may feel that way. And I've done a lot of work to try to perspective shift and see how they're seeing this, but I don't have the experience that way myself. And I don't think it's sustainable. And that's my perspective.
Yeah, but you remember a time when you did feel similarly.
Absolutely. And that's helped me a lot, is understanding that I've come from that same, like, not smaller mindedness, but I didn't have as much of a reach of where I could see things going.
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, I just want to reiterate that we're not talking about the quality of people's character.
Correct.
A major false, assumption or correlation that we make is that if somebody disagrees with us, then they're betraying a low quality character to us. And that's not accurate at all. Like, people can be very high quality of characters, very sincere, have a lot of desires to help people and be in integrity with themselves, like be good, solid human beings, and just fundamentally disagree with us. And also just not be able to take in as much territory, or maybe be seeing something that we're not seeing. So I do want to reiterate that we're not talking about how good a person is. We're simply talking about the perspectives they're able to see and the implications of those perspectives.
Yeah, what you see doesn't indicate your character. I mean, take my children, for example. I don't expect them to see everything I can see as an adult. They just don't have the viewpoints I have yet. They don't have the maturity. They don't have the experience. I don't look at my children and go, well, you're a bad person because you can't see this mature viewpoint I have as an adult.
Right.
That's just where they are in their perception. They just literally cannot see what they can't see.
Well, and conversely, there was a time period where I was pretty sure I was way smarter than my parents and wanted to correct them on everything they thought. And I just didn't see what they saw because they saw more territory than I did. So again, we're not talking about the quality of people's character. That said, going back to what you mentioned about, that you feel like there's really, like, we're not going to go away from a globalized perspective, that our territory boundaries are going to start becoming pretty murky. And especially with things like, environmentalism, like the air doesn't really care where the line is drawn on the land. And the ocean doesn't really care where the lines are drawn on the land. Like, it will carry things, it will drift things from one place to another, regardless of what man has determined as a territory boundary. So in a lot of ways, those territory lines, not a lot of ways, in like pretty much fundamentally, they are arbitrary. But they also serve a purpose, which is why they were drawn in the first place. So from my perspective, when I look at a very similar thought process as you're looking at, I usually see things more in terms of timelines as opposed to whether or not people are right or wrong. The question for me is, are they contextually right? Is this a time period in which their perspective is accurate, even if their perspective would be inaccurate in another timeline or another context, another situation? And this is where I think the tool, you mentioned, we mentioned the Graves model. I think this is when the tool of systems thinking comes in very handy. The tool of systems thinking basically indicates that there are nodes in the system. There are different components in a system that indicate whether or not the emergent of that is a good or a bad emergent, the desirable or undesirable emergent. So that kind of thinking is an emergent of entire system running. And the question of whether or not that's an okay emergent, that's an okay thought process, to me goes into another system where timelines are a major node in the system. So one of the things that I do is I listen to people that have all of these different perspectives or at varying stratified levels, of the Graves model or spiral dynamics. And I ask myself, their perspective, are they dead right for the time period in which we're in right now? And that's more of a complex thought process, I think. I think it's hard for people to not emphasize the now as being a trajectory forever. I think that's another piece, is that we assume that there's either progress or regression, that there's like one linear timeline, and we're either going forward or we're going backwards. And because I've gotten into systems thinking in my personal life and my personal development, what's happened is I've started to recognize that it's not just a line where we're either going forward or backwards. We're actually talking about trajectories and degrees of those trajectories. I mentioned this in a previous podcast where I said, you want to go to the moon. The math is insane, right? The amount of math you have to do to get on the right degree of trajectory to get to the moon is ridiculously precision oriented. And if you're off just by a hair, right? Like you're off by like a couple degrees. In the beginning, it's not that big of a deal, but by the time you get to the moon, because of the distance, like you're just going to miss it like crazy, right? You're going to miss it by miles, maybe thousands of miles. So for me, it's more like, as opposed to, are we progressing or are we regressing? I'm more thinking like, where's the nose of this thing pointed? And do we sometimes need a bit of a correction for some reason? Sometimes things are not regressive as they are simply like realigning the nose. And so when I look at people's perspectives, I ask myself, if I were to go only with their direction, would that be facing the nose of humanity on the right trajectory? And the answer is almost always, when I just take in one perspective, the answer is always that would be a disastrous trajectory. We need this check and balance system. We need people having all these different perspectives bubbling up, so that the tension of going back and forth between them is the correction that we use to be able to point the nose in the right direction. So sometimes something that feels like a catastrophic redirection of the nose of humanity, it feels completely like we're going backwards, but we're not going backwards. Like, nothing goes backwards. Progress never goes backwards. At no point in history has progress ever sustainably gone backwards.
At least not on purpose. I mean, maybe burning the Library of Alexandria or something,
right,
regressed our progress for a while, but it wasn't like humanity chose that.
Well, and it didn't fundamentally stop it. It stalled it.
Exactly.
Right? Like, losing the Library of Alexandria probably retarded our progress by a certain amount, but it didn't stop it. I mean, we're here, like, I've got a smartphone in my pocket. It's not like things, like, stopped, right? We didn't go backward. We kept going forward. And that, I mean, progress always wins, no matter what. So then the question is, are these corrections, like, they're not regressive. We're not going to go backwards. I mean, unless all of humanity dies, and then it's an irrelevant conversation. But as long as we're alive, it is very unlikely that we're going in a massively regressive way. So then, is this correction something that needed to happen? And I think the tool of systems thinking helps me recognize that these are more, regardless of whether or not the answer is the one I want, it helps me remember that there's a lot more going on than just somebody won an election and I'm really bummed out about that. Like, there are a lot of different factors to take into consideration. And when I do that, I realize that things, the complexity of things actually in some ways it's like discouraging, because it's like, oh, are we at a place in our human evolution to be able to deal with the complexity of the challenges we're facing? Like, that's one of my big questions, is, are we ready to be able to even solve some of these challenges? But the other piece is that I can't, to overemphasize any single node in the system is a little disingenuous. So if one thing happens that isn't ideal, that doesn't necessarily mean like the entire thing has just been hazed to the ground. And the complexity helps me remember that, to not overemphasize any one single factor.
How I think about it, I think of this in terms of almost like economics. So we have, from a basic economic standpoint, we have these market bubbles that come up. So around the year 2000, for example, Silicon Valley was exploding, and there were a lot of companies that were starting up with just an idea. They would get funding, and they would just start the company, and there was really no revenue stream, and they would hire all these staff on. They were hoping they could get bought out or go with an IPO, initial public offering, and make a lot of money and sell the company and cash out. But because there was no sustainability there, and there was actually no value being created or products being transferred, it created this bubble that eventually burst. And then that whole entire economy, that entire industry had a correction, like what we're talking about, a trajectory correction. We saw that with the housing crisis back in 2008. There was a real estate bubble here in the United States, I think a global scale too, that was not actual value being created. It was synthetic value, and it had a bubble burst and a correction happen from a business economic standpoint. And I think these things happen socially too. I think corrections happen when we are on an unsustainable path towards something. We have a correction happen. So just like when Silicon Valley's bubble burst, and just like when the housing crisis happened, these were unsustainable ecosystems running that would never last in their current form. And the market, unfortunately, business happens faster than social technologies. Business forced those things to correct themselves and figure that out, right? We had to regroup. And now Silicon Valley, 16 years later, at the time of this recording, is having a resurgence because it had that correction. And now most of the companies coming out of Silicon Valley are actually creating products and services that have actual value that people then can exchange money for, and it's much more sustainable. So that correction was important way back in 15 years ago. And these social corrections, I think, are important too. I think what they do is they help us realize that, because the majority of people voted this one way, obviously the progression we were on was not sustainable because they were not on board with this. So we have to correct course. There needs to be more messaging. There needs to be more space holding. We need to talk to our friends and neighbors and the people around us and give them a broader perspective of the world. They need to understand systems and how the ecology of the world is working. And obviously, a large majority of people, I mean, this is all from my perspective. I'm not saying I'm right, but this is my perspective. They don't understand how things are working on a global scale. And they're using their votes and their wallets to put forth their ideas that I don't think are seeing the whole picture. But I think that's important for the people that do see the big picture to take that into account. They're correcting course. There's something that was unsustainable about the way we were going, and that correction is important.
Yeah, well, and basically what that means is that anybody who was on the opposite side was also not seeing things accurately because they were creating something, like you said, that was unsustainable. So what ended up happening is that we got a very accurate assessment of where we're actually at on a macro scale.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, that's a gift. It's impossible to get to your destination when you're looking at a map if you don't know what your starting point is. And if we have an idealization of where our starting point is, it doesn't matter how clear our end game is. If we idealize where we're at on the map and that's not accurate, we're going to go in circles until we can get back to an accurate assessment of where we're really at. And I think that what has happened in the current political climate is that we got a really accurate assessment of what's going on. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a massive gift. Another tool that keeps coming up for me as I'm thinking about where we're at right now in the stream of time is according to generational theory, which is a very fascinating model in and of itself. We are what's called in the middle of winter. Now, if you want more information on generational theory, we did a podcast on it. Please go check it out. This is a lot of the content is based on the book called The Fourth Turning. And according to generational theory, we are in the season that's called winter. And each season in generational theory lasts 20 years, and we're dead in the middle of it. We're like 10 years in. So what ends up happening according to that model is that when you're in the middle of winter, just like if you were actually in the middle of winter, you're going to get more conservative of resource. You're going to feel less abundance. You're going to feel more a desire to preserve it for the people that you love. And so right now we're in a time period where we're sort of wired to think of ourselves as needing to conserve resource. And in winter, that's accurate. It's an accurate assessment that you need to be less foolhardy with your resources. And so right now, the concept of needing to conserve might be to some extent accurate. I don't know that to be true. I feel like we're in a position right now where we actually have quite a bit of abundance. That's my personal perspective. But I also recognize that not everybody feels that way, and perception a lot of times defines reality. So if our perception is that we need to conserve things, then our reality might bear that out, and it might be a situation where, like those kinds of choices may be the right choices to make. I don't know. We'll have to see how it plays out. But just recognizing that it's not forever. Like we're just in a season right now. And according to a very interesting and intriguing and compelling model, in 10 years, we're going to be out of that season and we're going to be in spring. And spring will have a completely different dynamic that follows that. So again, we're just mentioning some of the models and tools that we've talked about gathering, and we generally talk about applying it to the self and to the micro, to the individual when you're going through personal development. But these same tools that you use to understand and assess yourself and to become a better version of yourself can also be applied to the macro, to the bigger picture, and to feel a sense of optimism about that as well, to understand that we on a macro level have just as much potential for growth as we do on a micro level.
So I think that as we kind of wrap up this conversation, one of the things that we hinted this again earlier, you've done a lot of personal growth, a lot of personal development. If you've been part of this community and listening to our podcast a while, you've been on this journey with us as we improve ourselves together. You've gotten the skill and you've gotten the tool sets to not get yourself triggered around things and to be able to hold space and all these things you bring into personal growth realm. And it's, progress, not perfection. You're still on your journey. I'm still on mine. Antonia's still on hers. But realize that the work you've done now has prepared you for this moment. This, if you feel demoralized, if you feel out of control, realize that this work you've done allows you to say, wait a minute. I don't have to just take things as they are. I'm a fully empowered person. I've been doing the work up till now for this very type of thing, for the things to not work out well in life so I can show up my best when troubles come. That's the reason I've been doing this, whether it's personal stuff or mimetic or societal things. Like, I've been working myself so I can respond well. So this is not a time to retreat. This is not a time to be demoralized and to wallow in misery and to just say, screw everything. I'm just going to check out. This is a time to take what you've been learning and developing. This is a time to become galvanized around getting involved, speaking up, and finding alternative ways to make an impact that's not through maybe the political realm or institutions or even business, but maybe it's through social technology. Maybe it's through connecting with other people, through donations, or getting involved in that nonprofit in your town or that area that you want involved in your community. Like, these are ways you can get involved and feel empowered to make a difference. And if we all start to think in these terms and we don't get demoralized, I believe we will see positive change come out of this. It will be rallying for all of us.
Yeah. No, one of the most, I think, important things that comes out of personal development is that we put ourselves in an emotionally and psychologically abundant space. And when we're in an abundant space, that means we can give back to others. So, when we go through challenges and we go through hard times, that frequently is what helps us understand the gift that we bring to the world. When we go through a time period of dissatisfaction, that's what shows up, that's oftentimes what expresses to us the challenges in the world that we personally feel like we want to help solve. So when you talk about being galvanized during this time period, what it comes up for me is that, if you've been doing a ton of personal development work and you still don't know what it is that you want to bring to the world, the impact you want to make, sometimes it's these moments that help illustrate to you just what's important to you. Like, if you're heartbroken for some reason, what broke your heart? Did it break your heart enough to want to go address and attend to that thing? This is an opportunity for you to really find what your purpose is. And all that development work you've been doing on a macro level, on a micro level, now you can take some of that and give back and be in service and have an impact on the macro. So use this time period instead of feeling low and unable to do anything and disempowered. Recognize that this is actually the opportunity where you show yourself as powerful as you actually are. This is the time period where being empowered actually makes a difference in people's lives, because now you can use that empowerment to be somebody who does something big for the world around you.
This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where you get to shine. This is the performance you've been practicing for.
Just before we finish this, I do want to make a note that I don't believe that all of our podcast listeners are necessarily dissatisfied with the results of, say, the current presidential election that's happening at this time period in history.
Of course not. I know you have people that are excited about it.
Exactly. Some people are very happy with how things are turning out, and that's completely, that's fine. I don't want to make it seem like we believe that, this is all the end of the world. We attempt to be politically neutral on this particular podcast because we want to recognize that it's not really your politics that matter at this point. It's more about whether or not you're showing up as your best self.
Attitude and desire.
That's right. This is about personal development still. We have noticed in our community that there was a lot of feelings of dissatisfaction. And I've even noticed that with people who were able to get the presidential candidate that they personally desired, there's still a sense of dissatisfaction. There's still a sense of well, now what do we do? And I think that that's a general feeling for people that, we're in the middle of winter, if you subscribe to generational theory, and, not everybody's getting their needs met. So even if you're a person who's wildly happy about how everything panned out, that's perfectly acceptable too. And it's still a time period where you can figure out how to make an impact, because that means that things are going your way. That means the trajectory is, headed in a way that feels good to you. So regardless of what position you're in, I don't want to make it sound like if you should be dissatisfied with how everything has played out. Regardless, though, there is a sense that there's more that is needed right now. And I think that no matter who you are, that's an accurate assessment of the general climate. That there is a lot of communication that needs to happen and a lot of reaching out that needs to happen, regardless of how it shook down. So if you're in a good space right now and this feels good, use that energy to reach out to other people and have, communication around that, and really try to figure out how to solve challenges together. And if you're a person who's feeling demoralized and feeling low, This might be a time period where you really figure out something big about yourself, what impact you want to make. And no matter how it all shakes out, do what you can to use all of the personal development work that you have been focused on up to now to be of service to the rest of humanity.
What do you think? We want to hear from you. You come over to personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment or ask a question directly below the show. And we want you to be a part of the community and voice your voice here, not just our voice. We want to hear from you. Also, you can join our community of like minds. It's growing every day over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, if you would leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that would really help us out.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.